whirlwind tour of developments because 2024 was a very busy year in migration. Um, so there were a lot of developments. Again, I'm trying to kind of use this as a pointer exercise at what is there in the report to have more details of, and to just give an overview of what happened in the year. So if you have questions, we have a bit of time. So the overarching developments, first of all, is this kind of developments that touch a lot of different areas in migration. One of the big pieces of news, of course, is the Pact on Migration and Asylum. So this was proposed in 2020. A lot of this was a response to the large number of arrivals in 2015, 2016, and the kind of political issues that arose around those. And it was adopted in 2024. Ireland has the option to opt in to migration-related EU law. And Ireland decided to opt into the Pact. What that means is the Pact is 11 pieces of legislation. A lot of those are already in existence and are kind of being reformed or recast, as the European language calls it. And Ireland is opting into 7 of the 11, which you can see here. And for the other 4, they are Schengen-related measures. So Ireland can't opt in because we're not part of the Schengen area, but Ireland has indicated that we are planning to align our laws with those to the greatest extent possible. So you'll see here the 7 that Ireland is formally opting into. It covers different areas like reception, actual qualification for asylum, the asylum procedure, resettlement, relocation within Europe, so responsibility within Europe, and solidarity, Eurodac, that's data collection, and then kind of what crisis situations. People kind of ask us to summarize the pact, and I mean, summarizing the changes in any one of those pieces of legislation is really, really challenging. So we generally, it's very difficult to do. But if you were to summarize it quickly, kind of, it's the introduction of a border procedure, a solidarity mechanism that's mandatory, but with different modalities, increased safeguards generally for applicants, and some improved reception conditions requirements, legally binding timelines for the international protection process, expanded data collection and use for migration and for the enforcement of crime, and more oversight by the Commission and the European Union Asylum Agency, and more strategic and forecasting requirements. So then if we look into legal migration, or a lot of this to do with labour migration, the big piece of news in the year was the Employment Permits Act 2024, which was passed, and this is the largest reform of the employment permit system since 2006. The aim of this was to kind of consolidate employment permits law and make a more agile system to respond to increasing labour market shortages. There's a lot of provisions in the Act. I've just highlighted some here. So one is the change of employer after 9 months. Previously, this was 12 months for people on a general employment permit. The introduction of a seasonal employment permit, which is the first time in Ireland. It's the case in a lot of the rest of Europe. There's a seasonal kind of employment directive in the rest of Europe, and this basically is a permit for a maximum of 7 months per calendar year. It is quite focused. It generally is very relevant to the horticulture sector, where employment can be quite seasonal. It includes also the indexation of minimum annual remunerations. This is the minimum amount that you can pay people for an employment permit. And basically it allows the minister to annually assess the thresholds to see if they're in line with average earnings. It also allows for the additional conditions for the granting of permits. So the minister can say that, the employer has to provide accommodation or training or expenses, for example. And it also moves a lot of detail from primary to secondary legislation in this attempt to kind of be more agile and responsive. A major piece of news also was the right to work for partners of people on almost all employment permits. So this was previously the case for critical skills employment permit holders, but it was expanded to general employment permits and others. Minimum annual remuneration then. So there was a few different stories in here. So basically in 2023, there was a roadmap set out for increases to minimum annual remuneration as part of a review of the employment permit system. In January 2024, the first ones were actually increased. So the plan for the roadmap was it would be increased in January 2024, January 2025, and then indexed under the Employment Permits Act, like we just heard. So in January 2024, there was the first stage of increases, and you can see some of them there. Some of them were relatively large increases proportionally. Some employers raised concerns about sustainability. So the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment announced a review in December 2024 and deferred further increases pending the outcome of the review. That was actually just published last week, so it'll be next year's report. There was also government approval for the rollout of a single permit scheme. So that's over the next 3 years. So trying to put kind of administrative processes in place. Currently, there's a separate process for the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment and the Department of Justice for employment and residence permits. It's kind of two separate application processes. And eventually, Ireland has indicated that we may opt into the Single Permit Directive, which was just recast this year, which requires that the decision to issue, amend, renew, or reject a single permit is made as one administrative act within 90 days. Another piece of news in labour migration was that sea fishers were moved to general employment permits after a lot of kind of debate and criticism over the last around 10 years, and you can kind of follow that throughout the annual reports. Moving on then to international protection, which of course got a lot of media attention during the year. One of the big pieces of news, as we mentioned in the statistics, was the accommodation shortages. So IREC, the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, used the power to take a case in their own name for the first time since they were established in relation to this issue. And there were High Court and Court of Appeal cases, which Emily is going to bring you through later. 35 civil society organisations also signed a joint statement around this issue, kind of indicating that they think that homelessness is always unsafe, that it has detrimental health outcomes, and also criticising the policy of ordering congregated tents to disperse, arguing that they congregate for safety. In response to this, also we saw the adoption of the comprehensive accommodation strategy. So this kind of has a near-term and long-term strategy, and the idea is that it maintains the principles of the white paper but scales up the actual capacity. So the idea is basically that the white paper foresaw a much lower level of arrivals than have actually ended up occurring. So the idea of this is to try to scale it up. So it turns to a kind of a mixture of state-owned and commercial model, and foresees 6 months in reception and integration centres, and then moving on to accommodation centres if decisions still have not been issued. It also foresees contingency planning and more engagement with local communities as part of the longer-term strategy. Another piece of news from the year was that vulnerability assessments, which are a requirement of the Reception Conditions Directive, were paused and then partially resumed for the year, citing capacity issues. There was also quite a bit of news in international protection processing in an attempt to kind of speed up the process and to deal with the backlog, so increased resources, as we saw, the expansion of the accelerated process to the kind of the largest countries of arrival. So I think it was Nigeria and Jordan initially. And then we also saw efforts at digitalization and modernization of the IP system. There's more detail on that in the report. We also expanded designated safe countries, which are also put through the accelerated procedure. So you see there the list of countries that were added to the safe countries list. Decisions were also paused for Syrian applicants following the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, kind of awaiting, seeing what was going to happen in Syria. Another big piece of news, and this was in the part of the implementation of the white paper, is that the Health Information and Quality Authority commenced inspections of permanent IPAS accommodation in January 2024. So that was kind of long, something that NGOs had called for. And during the year, they did 60 inspections of 51 centres and found varying levels of compliance. There was issues flagged with governance and safeguarding. There's more details of that in the report. And IPAS indicated that when this happens, providers are required to produce compliance plans to kind of come up to the national standards. There was also an updated safe third country designation process to respond to the High Court case that found that there was insufficient safeguards in the process for designating the UK a safe third country. And just that's kind of the general safe third country process. Emily will tell you more about that case, but then additional safeguards were added to allow the UK to be added to that, and just generally allowing for labelling countries as safe third countries. In temporary protection then, the major story was changes to accommodation and income supports for arrivals from Ukraine. So in March 2024, this was changed for new arrivals only. And basically it changed to an entitlement to accommodation for a maximum of 90 days and a reduced income support during that time. That's in line with the daily expense allowance for asylum applicants. In September 2024, then this reduced income support was applied to all beneficiaries of temporary protection in state accommodation, so those who had arrived before March 2024 as well. And they get an extra allowance if they're in full board accommodation where they pay a contribution. Another major piece of news was a change to the citizenship revocation procedure, and anyone who's followed this will know. So this basically is about the power for the minister to revoke citizenship. And it followed a court case that found that the 1956 Act, the provision in the 1956 Act was deemed unconstitutional for having insufficient safeguards because previously the Committee of Inquiry's finding was not binding on the minister. So the new provision basically is that the committee operates independently of the minister. IREC and NGOs raised concerns in 2024 that it was added at the last minute and didn't go under pre-legislative scrutiny. And IREC indicated they're concerned that it's unlikely to withstand judicial scrutiny, and they're concerned that further litigation will be inevitable under it. In integration, then very quickly, I'm not going to be able to give this the time it deserves, but there was quite a few local integration initiatives. So local authority integration teams were established in most local authorities. There was community integration forums. These were initially a COVID response, and they were adapted to respond to asylum seekers, refugees, and BOTPs, and kind of coordinate that response. The Community Connection Project was established. So this funds 30 community link workers across the local development companies to work with host communities where there are issues with migrant communities. And the Community Recognition Fund happened again. So this allows for 50 million in communities that have been hosting asylum seekers or refugees for local community projects. There was also some implementation news on the National Action Plan Against Racism. So the Special Rapporteur was appointed and an advisory committee was established. Hate crime legislation was also passed in 2024. So this basically allows for increased prison sentences where it's proven that an offence it was aggravated by hatred. This followed kind of coincided with the European Commission letter of formal notice in October 2024 around compliance with certain frameworks. Hate speech elements were removed after a lot of debate and kind of criticism so that the act could pass. In the news of the integration strategy then, which as many of you might know expired in 2021, there was a second phase consultation to basically bring in groups who were insufficiently represented in the public consultation, but then there was also a decision to merge the integration strategy with a broader migration strategy. So it's become part of that larger process. And then finally, irregular migration, there were increased carrier sanctions. So this basically is the fines on airlines or transport companies who bring people into the country who don't have the correct papers. So they were increased from 3,000 to 5,000 following a review and a finding that the fines hadn't changed since 2003. There was also a north-south border policing strategy that was adopted, and of course that is relevant to migration. Visa requirements were introduced for some of these countries, two of which I think asylum applications were cited. So South Africa and Botswana, there had been relatively high asylum applications previously. And there was also a procurement process to re-establish charter flights for returns. Okay, so that is, yeah.
I was just going to jump in to just encourage people and give Ciara a little break to encourage people just to use the Q&A function. We're doing pretty well on time, so there is a good opportunity now to ask any questions that occur to you. Thanks, Ciara.
Yep. So there's a question in the chat about do you think the increasing competences of EUAA will have a strong effect on Ireland's asylum system when the overall desire to align with EU asylum legislation is considered? So just to give people context, I say that there's 11 pieces of legislation in the pact. That's kind of give or take. It depends on what you count. So one of the pieces of legislation that was actually passed previously was changing the European Asylum Support Office, EASO, into EUAA, the European Union Asylum Agency, and kind of giving it increasing competencies and support. And you kind of see throughout the pact that it has a lot more competencies, more oversight, more resources. So one of the things, for example, is that everyone was required to submit a reception contingency plan to the EUAA in April 2024. I think The EUA can provide also a lot of kind of operational support and training, which I think Ireland can learn a lot from. So I'm not sure will have a strong effect on Ireland's asylum system. I think there's also been an indication this year that EUA is going to support with the appeals process as well to try to scale up and deal with some of that backlog. Um, EUAA, Ireland has I think plenty to learn from other European countries, and because we've had less of a history of asylum, um, we in some areas have less capacity. So I think there are some advantages to that. Um, Other than that, I think what the overall impact we will see. Um, so there's also a question in the chat. I think it's from the statistics section. Do you gather information on skills or education level? I think this is for overall immigration, is it? Um, and we don't do we gather skills? I don't think we do it for the asylum report. I think we do it for other pieces of work that we do in the report. Um, we could, for example, get data on the split between critical skills and general employment permits. Definitely for non-EU. I think we're doing that actually for a piece of work on labour migration that we're doing at the moment. But for this report, we don't really gather information on that. Okay.